Let me tell you about a job that most people do not know exists, a job that keeps your social media clean. Content moderator, 100,000 people, maybe more, scatter across the world, sitting in offices in the Philippines, India, Kenya, Morocco, watching screens 8 hours a day, sometimes more. And what do they watch? Beheadings, child abuse, suicides, rapes, torture, animal cruelty, the absolute worst content that humans upload to the internet. They see it, they evaluate it, they decide whether to delete it. And they do this for $10 a day. In some countries, $10 per day. This is not accident. This is not unfortunate necessity. This is structure. The structure through which platforms externalize their obscenity onto disposable workers. And I will show you exactly how this works. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Tinder. These platforms promise connection, community, expression, freedom. But this freedom, this openness, this refusal to censor produces a problem. Users upload everything, the beautiful and the horrific, the meaningful and the traumatic. And platforms cannot show you beheadings between vacation photos, cannot show you child abuse mixed with cat videos, cannot show you child abuse mixed with cat videos. Need humans to watch the content before you see it. To filter the obscenity, to protect you from the worst of what humans produce. But here is the problem. Here is the obscene part. The part that reveals the whole structure. Platforms cannot acknowledge this labor, cannot make it visible, because making it visible would reveal the lie that social media is organic community, natural expression, free connection, when the truth is that every photo you see, every video you watch, every post you read has been curated, filtered, moderated by workers you never see, in countries you never think about, earning wages you could not survive on. And these workers, they suffer, they develop PTSD, depression, anxiety, some attempt suicide, some succeed. They describe nightmares, flashbacks, inability to sleep, hypersensitivity to noise, numbness, desensitization, the complete spectrum of trauma symptoms. And when they report this suffering, when they seek help, the platforms say, we provide wellness resources, we offer counseling, we care about worker well-being. But they do not change the structure, do not reduce quotas, do not increase wages, do not acknowledge responsibility, because acknowledge responsibility would require admitting that platforms profit from traumatizing workers, that user freedom depends on worker trauma, that your innocence requires their suffering. And this cannot be admitted, so the trauma is externalized, outsourced, made invisible through arm's length contractors, through intermediary companies, through layers of deniability that ensure platforms are never directly responsible for the workers they destroy. Let me be very precise about the mechanism, very clear about how this operates. Platforms do not directly employ most content moderators. They contract with outsourcing companies, Accenture, Cognizant, Teleperformance. These companies hire the moderators, set the wages, manage the work, and platforms say, we are not the employer, we are the client. We set content policy, but the outsourcing company manages workers. If there are problems, talk to them. This is the genius of outsourcing. Not just cost reduction, but responsibility elimination. The platform benefits from labor, but does not employ workers. So when workers suffer, the platform can say, not our employees, not our problem. And the outsourcing company, they say, we just implement platform policies. We do what the client requires. If the work is traumatic, that is the nature of the work, not our fault. So responsibility disappears, falls into the gap between platform and contractor, between client and employer, between profit and pain, and workers. Workers have no recourse, no leverage, because they are not employed by the platforms they serve, and the companies that employ them are competing globally for platform contracts. A race to the bottom, always cheaper, always more disposable. If workers in Kenya demand better conditions, the contract moves to India. If workers in India organize, the contract moves to the Philippines. If workers in the Philippines strike, the contract moves to Morocco. This is the global supply of disposable labor, always available, always cheaper, always replaceable. Itvaya. And throughout this entire structure, the trauma remains invisible. The suffering remains private. The cost remains externalized. You scroll through Instagram, see vacation photos, cat videos, inspirational quotes, everything clean, everything safe, everything innocent. And you never think about the moderators, the ones who watched beheadings, so you would not have to. The ones who evaluated child abuse, so you would never see it. The ones who absorbed obscenity, so you could maintain innocence. This is what I mean by outsourced obscenity. The platforms produce it, users upload it, but workers absorb it. The trauma that should belong to the system is displaced onto individuals, outsourced, made invisible. And now, and this is where it gets really obscene, AI is replacing them. In 2025, TikTok announced that 80% of violative content is now removed by automated technologies. 80%, up from maybe 40% just 2 years ago. And what does this mean for moderators? It means they are being eliminated, automated away, replaced by algorithms that do not feel trauma, do not develop PTSD, do not suffer. In November 2024, TikTok cut over 100 UK-based safety jobs. In February 2025, global safety teams faced redundancies, and this pattern is accelerating across platforms. The moderators who absorbed trauma to train the AI are now being replaced by the AI they trained. Their suffering was the data set. Their trauma was the training data. And now that the AI is trained, they are disposable. This is perfect efficiency, perfect capitalism. Use human labor to train automation, then automate the humans away. Externalize trauma during the transition. Eliminate trauma after the transition. And throughout the entire process, profit. Users remain innocent. Platforms remain clean. And workers disappear. Some to unemployment, some to disability, some to suicide, but always disappear. Now, you might say, but Zizek, AI moderation is good. It means humans do not have to see traumatic content anymore. And yes, this is what platforms say. This is the justification. We are protecting workers by automating their work away. But look at the structure. Look at what this reveals. For years, platforms knew content moderation was traumatic. New workers were suffering. New PTSD was a result of the work. And they did nothing. They outsourced. They paid low wages. They replaced traumatized workers with fresh workers. They did not invest in worker well-being, did not reduce quotas, did not increase pay, did not make the work sustainable. They just waited for AI to become good enough, waited for automation to become cheap enough, and then they replaced the workers. This is not compassion. This is not protecting workers. This is elimination. The traumatized workers who trained the AI are now unnecessary. So they are discarded. And this discarding is presented as progress. Look, we are using AI now. No more human trauma. We are so ethical. But the humans who were traumatized, they remain traumatized. They remain damaged. They remain abandoned with their PTSD, their depression, their ruined sleep, their destroyed mental health. And platforms say, we provided counseling, we offered resources. It is not our fault if workers are damaged, but it is their fault. It is their content, their users, their profit model that required workers to absorb trauma, that made trauma necessary for platform function. And now that trauma can be automated, workers are eliminated, but the trauma they absorbed, that trauma remains in their minds, in their bodies, in their lives. The platform extracted their mental health, used it to train AI, then discarded them and called this innovation. This is what I mean by outsourced obscenity. The platforms do not just outsource labor, they outsource suffering, the psychological cost of content moderation, the trauma of exposure to obscenity, and they outsource it to workers who have no choice. Workers in countries where $10 a day is acceptable, where PTSD is not diagnosed, where mental health support does not exist, where workers are disposable. And these workers, they describe something interesting, something that reveals the depth of the trauma. They say that initially, the first weeks, the content is horrifying, shocking, disturbing. They have nightmares, cannot sleep, cannot eat. But then, over time, they become numb, desensitized, the horror becomes routine, the violence becomes normal. And you might think, good, they adapted, they are no longer disturbed. But this is not adaptation. This is destruction. The destruction of normal human response to horror. The destruction of empathy. The destruction of, they do not stop suffering. They stop feeling the suffering, which is worse, because now they cannot even recognize their own trauma. And platforms know this, know that workers become desensitized, know that this desensitization is damage, permanent psychological damage. But they do not care, because desensitized workers are more productive, process more content, make fewer errors of oversensitivity, become efficient until they break, until they attempt suicide, until they cannot continue. And then they are replaced, always replaced with fresh workers who will go through the same cycle, bureaucracy. This is the factory, the invisible trauma factory, where human capacity for empathy is systematically destroyed, where psychological health is extracted and discarded, where workers are consumed to keep your feed clean, and you never see this, never think about this, because the whole point of the structure is to keep this invisible. You open Instagram, scroll through photos, everything is pleasant, safe, appropriate, and you think, what a nice platform, so well managed, so family friendly, but this family friendly appearance is produced through trauma, through workers watching child abuse, so you do not have to, through workers evaluating beheadings, so you never see them, through workers absorbing obscenity, so you can maintain innocence. And this reveals something profound about how contemporary capitalism functions, how it externalizes costs, how it makes suffering invisible. In the old factory system, exploitation was visible. Workers in factories making products obviously exploited. Low wages, long hours, dangerous conditions, visible, but content moderation, invisible. The labor happens in other countries, the trauma happens in private. The cost is psychological rather than physical. And the beneficiaries, users, platforms, advertisers, never see the workers who make it all. This is the perfect externalization, the perfect hiding of cost, the perfect exploitation. Because you cannot organize around what you cannot see, cannot protest what you do not know about, cannot demand change for workers you do not know exist. And platforms depend on this invisibility, depend on users never thinking about content moderation, never asking who decides what I see, who filters the content, who protects me from obscenity. Because if users ask these questions, they would discover the answer. And the answer is trauma, outsourced trauma, trauma as business model. And now AI, the final solution. The elimination of the problem by eliminating the workers, we automated content moderation. No more human trauma. Problem solved. But the workers who were traumatized, still damaged, still abandoned, and now also unemployed. Perfect efficiency, perfect cruelty. Use humans to train AI, traumatize them in the process, then replace them with AI and call this progress. And throughout this entire process, platform never acknowledge responsibility, never compensate workers for permanent psychological damage, never admit that their profit model requires suffering. They just say, we provided resources, we offered counseling, workers chose this job, not our fault if they are damaged. But this is ideology, pure ideology, because choice implies alternatives. And workers making $10 a day in countries with few jobs, they do not have alternatives. They have necessity, and necessity is not choice. Necessity is force, economic force, structural force, the force that makes people choose between trauma and poverty, between psychological distraction and platforms depend on this force, depend on global inequality, depend on workers having no alternatives. Because if workers had alternatives, they would not choose content moderation, would not choose trauma, would not choose distraction. But platforms present this as free choice, as voluntary labor, as workers choosing to moderate content. And when workers are damaged, they made their choice. They knew what the job was, not our responsibility. This is how exploitation is hidden, how suffering is externalized, how trauma is made invisible. And what is the solution? What can be done? Some say better working conditions, higher pay, mental health support, but this is not enough because the problem is not conditions. The problem is structure. The problem is that platforms profit from user-generated content. And user-generated content includes obscenity. And obscenity requires moderation. And moderation requires trauma. You cannot have unmoderated platform because unmoderated platform become cesspools, filled with abuse, violence, horror, become unusable. But you also cannot moderate without cost, without someone watching the content, evaluating it, absorbing it. And if that someone is human, they are traumatized. If that someone is AI, they were trained by traumatized humans. This is the trap. This is the structure. Platforms promise freedom of expression, but freedom of expression produces obscenity, and obscenity requires moderation, and moderation requires suffering. Either human suffering or human suffering displaced onto AI training, but always somewhere suffering. And platforms externalize this suffering, make it invisible, hide it in other countries, pay poverty wages, use outsourcing to eliminate responsibility. And when possible, automate it away. This is not bug, this is feature. This is how the system works, how it must work, how it can only work, because acknowledging the cost would require changing the model, would require admitting that user freedom depends on worker trauma, that your clean feed depends on someone's destroyed mind, and this cannot be admitted. So the trauma remains invisible, the workers remain disposable, and the suffering remains externalized until AI replaces them, and then the suffering disappears. Not because no one suffered, but because the ones who suffered are gone. Unemployed, damaged, abandoned. And this is presented as solution, as progress, as ethical innovation. Look, we eliminated human trauma by eliminating humans. Problem solved. But the humans who were traumatized, still traumatized. The damage done, still done. The suffering absorbed, still suffered. The only difference is now they are invisible. Now they are gone. Now they cannot testify. This is the final obscenity, the final externalization, the elimination of the witness, the disappearance of the traumatized, the erasure of evidence. And platforms call this progress, call this ethical, call this innovation, when the truth is simpler, darker, more obscene. They used humans until humans were no longer needed, traumatized them to train AI, then discarded them and called the discarding liberation. We liberated workers from traumatic labor by firing them. This is not liberation, this is abandonment. The same abandonment we saw with housing, the same abandonment that appears throughout the system. Use people, extract value, discard them, and call it progress, and the obscenity, the violence, the trauma, it remains. In the minds of workers, in their damaged lives, in their ruined mental health, but invisible, always invisible, hidden in other countries, hidden in unemployment statistics, hidden in silence. Because traumatized workers do not write think pieces, do not publish memoirs, do not appear on podcasts. They just disappear into poverty, into disability, into silence. And platforms continue, users continue. The feed remains clean, the content remains moderated. And no one thinks about who paid the cost. This is the invisible trauma factory. Not called factory, not visible as factory, but factory nonetheless. Where human psychological health is the raw material, where trauma is the byproduct, where workers are consumed and discarded, and where the final product is your innocence, your clean feed, your family-friendly platform, and you never see the cost. Never think about the cost, because the whole point of the structure is to keep the cost invisible. This is not accident, this is design, perfect design, efficient design, obscene design. Until we name it, until we make it visible, until we recognize that your innocence requires their trauma, nothing will change. The factory will continue. The trauma will continue. The externalization will continue. And workers will continue to be consumed. To keep your feed clean, this is the invisible trauma factory. And it is working